Amador County Farm Day, bringing agriculture to the classroom.
Well, hello, my name is Tracy Celio and I'm with the UCCE Master Gardeners, and welcome to Farm Day. Here we are in the Master Gardener Teaching Garden, and this is a place where the Master Gardeners invite the public to come out and learn about gardening and how to take care of their plants and soil to grow food and beautiful plants for home environments. So today I'm going to talk to you about worms, but specifically about worm composting. And why worm composting? Well, we're going to get to talk about all of that. But I want to talk about vermicomposting, and if you guys can say that with me, we'll do it really slow. Vermicomposting. And composting part of that word is just the breakdown of food and organic materials, and the verma part, well, that's the worm part. And so these are specific worms that their castings, which is actually the worm poop, comes out and it turns into a really great compost or fertilizer for your plants. Now, the most important thing for any plant is the soil. And so for Master Gardeners, the soil health is the thing we focus the most on. And we add worm compost to create a healthy soil. Now, what is the worm compost? So the worm compost, and I have an example of a worm right here. The worm castings come out of the back of the worm, and that's right, it is poop. The front of the worm is their face, and we'll talk a little bit more about worm anatomy in a minute. But what they expel out the end is the worm castings, the worm compost, and that is the fertilizer that builds healthy soil for your gardens. Now, fertilizer is just nutrients. So it's like vitamins that you might take. It's just nutrients for your plants and for the soil. And some important ones are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And worm compost is really high in those. Although it's not too high, it's really balanced, which is perfect for your plants. So what kind of worms? So not just any worm makes worm compost. It needs to be California red wigglers. So that's another word that I think is really important. Let's say together, California red wigglers, because you can go in your backyard, and I bet some of you have done this. You can dig into the soil and you'll find worms. Sometimes night crawlers if you go fishing, but those worms are not composting worms usually. The California red wigglers are the ones that do the composting. And so, let's see, I'm going to put these out. And I have a few worms in here that we can look at together. Now, worms don't like sunlight, and it's not because, like me, that their eyes are sensitive. It's because they don't have eyes. It's because their bodies are sensitive, and so they want to crawl away and get away from that sunlight. So I won't keep them out here for too long. But this is what California red wigglers look like. And somewhere, I wanted to make sure and show you this, is an egg. And so there's one right there. There's another one right there. Can you see those two golden eggs? They're little tiny, and inside of those are just baby worms. I'm going to put these guys back. We can maybe get another one out in a minute because they're always fun to look at and play with. But for now, I'm going to put them back, and I'm going to put this on top so that they can crawl. What they're going to do is they're going to go down to the middle or the bottom to get more moisture and to get away from the sunlight. Okay, so we talked about California red wigglers being composting worms. They need three things, just like you, to survive. They need food, they need shelter, and they need water. So worms are 90% water. Their bodies are 90% water, and they breathe through their skin. So that's different than us, right? We're probably about 90% water, but we don't breathe through our skin. We breathe with our lungs and through our nose and mouth. But worms, they actually breathe through their body. And that's why when you look at a worm, they kind of have a wet look to them. are a little bit like shiny. They're not soaking wet, but they just have a little bit of kind of mucusy goo on them, and that helps them to breathe and to respirate. So let's see, we talked about the water. Now we should talk a little bit about the shelter and the food. I think we should do that over at our worm box over here. Okay, so follow me to our worm box. This is where the worms shelter. And a worm box, if you have one in your house, does anyone have one in their house? I do. I have one in my kitchen, and it's about this big. So your worm box, their house, can be any size, and the worm population will grow to the size of that box. They won't grow outside of it, and they won't stay too small. They'll become the perfect size for whatever house. But Master Gardeners, our box is pretty big. It's about 6 feet long, it's about 3 feet wide, and we feed them kitchen scraps. So this is where they live. You can see we have shade cloth to keep it nice and shady because the worms don't like sunlight. And we feed them in these trays. And you can see in here, there's a lot of newspaper. So you need the carbon, which is in the newspaper, and then food for the worms. Now, I brought some food with me today. Some things from your kitchen, like maybe old vegetables, or maybe the parts that you don't eat. Maybe some clippings from your yard. These are all things that the worms will eat, they'll process, and then they'll turn into those beautiful worm castings. Now, believe it or not, worms like eggshells, and I had some in here. Where did they go? Worms need eggshells all broken up because inside of their gizzards, that's the middle part of the worm, they will crunch up all of those things, and it makes them healthy, and it keeps the worms healthier so that they can process food. Things like peach pits, all of those things can be turned into worm food. So how do we feed them? We just pour in the food. It's nice if we can break it up or cut it up into small sizes. And we set it in these trays. And then we cover it. Now, you'll see that these newspapers are moist. We'll come and we will spray them. We want them moist like a wrung out sponge, but not soaking wet. Because the worms breathe through their skin. So we don't want this to be soaking wet for them. We want their environment just to be nice and moist. Now then we come to their shelter and we harvest the worm castings in the bottom. And you can see here, the worm castings fall from the little tray onto the bottom of our bin. And there it is. You can see that there's still some eggshells in there and some other goodies. So what we'll do is we'll come in with a sifter and we'll separate the worms from things that still need to decompose. We'll put those back in the food system, and then eventually we'll have nothing but beautiful black gold, and that's the worm compost. So we're gonna go back to the table, and I have some quiz questions for you to get to know a little bit more about worms. So first things, I mentioned to you that worms have a gizzard, and I told you that that's the part in the center that where they'll take eggshells and other food and they process the food there. That's right in the center, and you can see how the worms have all of these segments? Well, right in the center, that's the gizzard. And you can see that middle part is a little bit closer to the front end than it is to the back end. Okay. So what do you think? Do red wigglers have eyes? I asked you this question at the beginning of our conversation today, and I told you no, worms don't have eyes. Since they live in the dark, they don't need them like you and I do. But what they do have is receptors, and those receptors can feel vibration. So there's cars going by. I can guarantee you the worms in that box can feel the vibration of the car's movement. They can also sense light and touch. So if you were to touch a worm, it would contract away from you. Next question, can worms smell? Not like you and I can, but worms can sense. The same thing, they have those receptors, and they're they react to chemicals. And so different chemicals in the environment, for example, citrus. If I was to put citrus in the worm bin, they would react not really well to that because they don't like the chemical that's in citrus. And so that's something you wouldn't put in your worm bin. Do they breathe? Well, we talked about that too, didn't we? What do you think? Do they breathe? Yeah, they sure do. Worms breathe out of their skin. And how do they move? Do worms have legs? Do they have arms? No, but they have muscles, and they have these segments, and there's these muscles between every single one of them. And for them to move, they expand and contract, and expand and contract. And that's how they move forwards or backwards, and that's how they get around in their environment. But they also have these really cool things. They're not legs, but they're little tiny hairs called setae, and those help them to attach to the earth that they live in and to move up and down. So if they didn't have those little setae, they might be able to move up and down, expanding and contracting, but they couldn't propel forward or backwards. So they have those really cool parts. Which is the head and which is the bottom? Can you remember this one? What's the head on the worm and what's the bottom? Well, they look exactly the same, don't they? Yeah, they do. The head is usually closer to the middle than it is to the end. So that worm poop, that black gold, the castings, that comes out of the end, which is right here. Okay, so today I hope you learned that worms eat my garbage. They eat things, kitchen scraps like old lettuce, banana peels, eggshells. They don't like meat, they don't like citrus, but they like all of those things that maybe are grown in your garden. They can then process those when you put them in a worm bin and turn them into compost, black gold, worm castings. And anyone can do this. It's really easy. You can do it in your classroom, you can do it in your house, or you can do it in your teaching garden like the master gardeners. So thank you for joining us today and have a great day.
Amador County Farm Day is brought to you by the University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources 4-H program, the Amador County Farm Bureau, the City of Plymouth, the Amador Resource Conservation District, Charles Spinetta Winery and Vineyard, Tumbas Vineyards, CGDRE Vineyard and Winery, Cooper Vineyards, Sierra Pacific Industries, and your local farmers, ranchers, foresters, and agricultural professionals. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more educational videos.